Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 20 quarterback rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, as I progress throughout today's video, I'll be presenting individual quarterbacks, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions, and of course, statistics in order to justify their overall rankings, so that as we approach our 2024 fantasy football drafts, we can make the most informed decisions possible. Now, as I progress throughout today's video, any statistic that I do mention is for a 4-point per passing touchdown format. Additionally, if you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, travel down to the description of the video. There are timestamps in the description of every single one of my videos so that you can go ahead and skip through and find the players you are specifically looking for. Outside of that, while you're down in the description, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We are on our way to 100,000 subscribers. I cannot thank you guys enough for all the support. Of course, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2024 season with the singular goal of trying to help you capture a 2024 fantasy football championship. And for those of you who are trying to gain an even greater advantage upon your league mates, be sure to get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. You can either head on over to Patreon down in the description or check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first time deposit match, but you're also going to be able to get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. Those rankings will be updated weekly over the course of August, so I'll send you updated emails every single time. Additionally, besides the off-season rankings and draft guide, you'll get regular season content in regards to rankings every single Sunday morning from my email directly to yours. These rankings are by position, by tier, include flex, kicker, defense, half PPR, and full PPR rankings, all included. So for those of you who want an advantage, not only this offseason, but for the entirety of the 2024 fantasy football season, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew today. Of course, get your hands on my 2024 fantasy football draft guide. And for those of you who are wondering if you could take advantage of the opportunity, based on your current location, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine said eligibility. And of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get into talking about my top 20 quarterback rankings. Beginning with our number one, in my opinion, Josh Allen is by far and away the greatest fantasy football quarterback of all time. In 3 of the last 4 seasons, he has been the number 1 overall ranked quarterback. And in those last 4 seasons, he has put up a base minimum of 390 fantasy points. Again, no one is even close within that category. Of course, second best would be Patrick Mahomes, who is obviously on his tail, but hasn't kept up mainly because of the overall contributions that Josh Allen presents every single season with his rushing ability. Now, of course, for the last 4 years, Josh Allen's been averaging between 23 to 25 fantasy points per game. But what we saw late last season was Josh Allen elevating to the next level. When we look at his overall statistics in a 4-point per passing touchdown format, from weeks 1 through 10 with Ken Dorsey as the offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills, Josh Allen was averaging 22.46 fantasy points per game. Then we transitioned to the era in which Joe Brady is the offensive coordinator, of course, after Ken Dorsey was fired, after they lost that tough game against the Denver Broncos, I think if I'm not mistaken, in week 10. But from weeks 11 through 18, Josh Allen was averaging 25.73 fantasy points per game. And if in fact you include the NFL playoffs, in which both of those games he scored 30 plus fantasy points, I mean, the potential for success for Josh Allen going into this new era of the Buffalo Bills is extremely high. And that is why we continue to have him as our number 1. Similar to guys like Travis Kelce, Christian McCaffrey, and Tyreek Hill, Josh Allen has proven sustained excellence over the last couple seasons. And that is why we continue to have him as our number 1, despite all of the changes that is happening within this overall receiving core and within this offense. So as we approach this upcoming season, yes, let's go ahead and address the overall conversation regarding this receiving core. There's no more Stephon Diggs. There's no more Gabriel Davis. There's no more Deontay Hardy. Sherfield's also absent within this offense. And even though those last 2 names didn't contribute much, if you take their overall targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns, that is quite literally 50% of the Buffalo Bills offense being extracted and not returning in 2024. The only wide receiver that is still on roster that caught a pass from Josh Allen last season is Khalil Shakir. And I understand for many of us that could be, a red flag, and you might not want to go ahead and potentially invest in Josh Allen, but understand, even with limited usage of Gabriel Davis and Stephon Diggs late last season, from weeks 11 into the NFL playoffs, he was still a dominant force because of his rushing ability. This time last season, many of you guys in the comment section were saying, Josh Allen's not going to run the ball as much, Andrew. I don't know why you still have him as your number 1. He really isn't going to run as much because they don't want to get him hurt. And the fact of the matter is, regardless of whether there is designed runs within an offense, he is always going to scramble because that is one of his initial instincts as a quarterback. And that's why he continued his sustained volume of rushing attempts. 111 last season for 524 yards. And of course, 15 rushing touchdowns, all 15 of which were scored within the red zone. That's why many of us who invest in James Cook should be a little bit, weary of the potential of that once again occurring. I mean, last season, Josh Allen was scoring 8.38 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. That is the equivalent of him throwing 2 extra touchdowns per game. So just putting that into perspective, of course, he's going to continue to find success because of that rushing upside. I'm not too worried about the absence of guys like Stephon Diggs and Gabriel Davis. You still have talented players within this offense, and they're going to approach the future the same way in which the Kansas City Chiefs did with Patrick Mahomes, removing Tyreek Hill from the overall equation, boosting up Dalton Kincaid's overall opportunity, bringing guys like Curtis Samuel, of course, Keon Coleman drafted this offseason that are going to immediately help Josh Allen get back to the number 1 overall standing in 2024. Now let's go ahead and move on to our number 2, another quarterback who in 2023 scored 15 rushing touchdowns. That's Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. Jalen Hurts in the last 2 seasons has been a top 3 quarterback in both of those instances. Even if you go back to 2021, prior to his injury, he was the number 2 overall quarterback in fantasy football. So he has been a top 3, top 2 quarterback in each of the last 3 seasons, averaging about 22 to 25 fantasy points throughout that span of time. So of course, success is going to be expected from Jalen Hurts going into 2024, as quite frankly, he's continued to be great, even with the offensive coordinator changes that we have seen year over year. You go back, in 2021, he had Shane Steichen, a fantastic offensive coordinator. We, of course, have seen what he's been capable of accomplishing with the Indianapolis Colts already. Last season was Johnson, which really, wasn't the best fit. That's why they're moving on from him and bringing in Kellen Moore this offseason. Kellen Moore last season was the offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Chargers, but prior to that was the offensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys since 2019, and he found a lot of success with the Dallas Cowboys. The last season with them, in fact, the Cowboys were number 7 in terms of passing attempts, number 4 in completions, number 5 in passing yards, and number 3 in passing touchdowns. Additionally, on top of it, the Dallas Cowboys that season led the National Football League in points per game, 31.2. They were number 3 overall in terms of total touchdowns scored in the National Football League in terms of offensive touchdowns, which they had 55 within that given season. So hopefully Kellen Moore can come in, and with all the weapons he has at his disposal, Jalen Hurts, Saquon Barkley, A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, they can elevate the overall potential for success in the case of Jalen Hurts, which again, we have seen what his overall, upside is. That's 25 points per game. He accomplished that in the past, and hopefully he can once again return to that overall level of success, especially considering his rushing touchdown numbers have been so ridiculous. Now, again, those numbers could end up dipping a little bit this year, and it wouldn't surprise me due to the absence of, future Hall of Famer Jason Kelce. That brotherly shove may not be as successful considering the fact that, yes, Jalen Hurts scored 15 rushing touchdowns last season, but 11 of those rushing touchdowns were literally from the 1-yard line as he was pushed into the end zone. But even in prior seasons, 10 rushing touchdowns, 13 rushing touchdowns, and of course, most recently 15. So even with Jason Kelce's absence and the addition of Saquon Barkley within this goal line overall scheme, I still believe that, Jalen Hurts, by far and away, the best number 2 quarterback going into 2024. The final quarterback I wanted to mention for the S tier is Patrick Mahomes. And though many of you may not believe that Patrick Mahomes deserves to be in the S tier going into our 2024 fantasy football draft, let me just put this into perspective. In 2023, in comparison to his 2022 overall statistics, Patrick Mahomes threw 14 less touchdowns and 882 less passing yards. He went from averaging 24.49 fantasy points per game in 2022 to averaging 17.51 fantasy points per game the following year. I mean, an 8-point slide is ridiculous, and I don't expect that to be the norm for Patrick Mahomes going forward. It was a bad year to say the very least because the weapons that surrounded him weren't up to par. Now, you bring in guys like Marquise Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy, who ran the fastest 40 time in NFL Combine history. You're bringing in speedsters on the outside who could absolutely elevate Patrick Mahomes and bring back the deep ball within this offense that has been missing since the absence of Tyreek Hill just a couple years back. So I truly do believe out of all the quarterbacks that could potentially make a 180 switch within their overall career and their fantasy value, Patrick Mahomes is the guy that we have to bet on, because he is the best quarterback in the National Football League. And not only that, for fantasy purposes, he's always going to be relevant within his overall mobility and rushing upside, because he has demonstrated for each of the last 3 seasons, if you take his averages in terms of rushing statistics per year, he's averaging 70 rushing attempts, 384 rushing yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns per season. That's 2.97 fantasy points per game on top of whatever he's able to accomplish through the air. I really do believe that the overall additions to this offense, specifically these wide receivers, are going to help elevate Patrick Mahomes this upcoming season and get him back into the conversation of being a top 3 quarterback for fantasy purposes. Now, speaking of rushing upside and how that can absolutely help, let's go ahead and talk about the quarterback who holds the record for most rushing yards for a quarterback within a single season. That is Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens to begin the A tier as our number 4. Now, we know that Lamar Jackson, when healthy, is a top 5 quarterback every single season. You go back to last season, he was the number 3 in terms of fantasy points per game on average, averaging 20.7. The year prior in 2022, before he got injured, he was number 6 amongst all quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points per game on average. You take it even a step further back to 2021. He was number 5 amongst all quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points per game on average. Over the course of the last 3 seasons, he has been averaging between 20 and 22 fantasy points per game. And even though we know his upside potential to be someone who could very easily score 25 to 27 fantasy points per game on average because he has demonstrated that in the past, I don't expect him to get to those overall upside numbers, but I do expect him to continue to be consistent within the role that he has within this offense, averaging about 21 fantasy points per game. And that's why I have him as my number 4 overall quarterback. I mean, just based on his overall rushing upside that he presents, he makes himself a safe quarterback play every single game and every single season. If we go ahead and take his overall rushing yard per game averages over the course of 2021 to 2023, his per game season averages on a 17-game pace should be 174 rushing attempts, 1,046 rushing yards, and 4 rushing touchdowns. And again, those are incredible numbers that have to go ahead and make up for some of the passing deficiencies that he has. Now, even though last offseason, this time last year, we all talked about Todd Monken coming in and potentially elevating this offensive passing game, that quite frankly just wasn't the case. In fact, Lamar Jackson threw the ball 3.5 less times per game with Todd Monken than he did the final season in which he played with Greg Roman as the offensive coordinator. So they're throwing the ball less, they're running the ball a little bit more, and of course, letting Lamar Jackson utilize his legs as much as they possibly can because they know that that is his golden feature. That is exactly what separates him from the entire pack, and that is what is extremely difficult for defenses to stop. I'm not worried about, the weapons that surround him. I'm not worried about his offensive line. I know that Lamar Jackson is going to continue to be consistent. Obviously, there has been an injury history with him both in 2021 and 2022, and we always have to be worried about that, but we want to be positive, and we're going to continue to, of course, expect Lamar Jackson to be a top 5 upside quarterback every single season. Now, speaking of injuries that could potentially play a factor, let's talk about our next quarterback and stay within the AFC North with Cincinnati Bengals starting quarterback Joe Burrow. Now, even though Joe Burrow's picture on screen looks a little bit different than what he currently sits with now with the M&M bleached blonde hair, but going into this upcoming season, the conversation of health is always going to be kind of asterisked next to Joe Burrow's name, mainly because last season obviously ended his year with a season-ending wrist injury. And if you look at the last couple seasons, go back a couple years, an ACL injury. And of course, going into the following season, he had to recover from that. Then the next season after that, he had an appendectomy. His appendix, of course, tried to sabotage him from the inside. They had to remove it. And then last offseason, prior to the beginning of the year, a calf injury. Again, there have been so many injuries with Joe Burrow, yet he has been so good for fantasy football when he's on the field. You go back to 2021, he was the number 10 quarterback in terms of fantasy points per game. The year after, the number 4 overall ranked quarterback in fantasy points per game. And most recently last season, in games in which he was fully healthy, number 6 in terms of fantasy points per game amongst all quarterbacks. Now, prior to his season-ending injury in 2023, once he was fully healthy and the calf wasn't literally slowing him down and preventing him from making plays, he had a 5-game consecutive streak of 2 or more touchdowns. And again, throughout that span of time, finding a lot of success for fantasy football. Now, additionally, even in his absence, Jake Browning was able to come in, the backup quarterback of the Cincinnati Bengals, and he picked up exactly where Joe Burrow left off. From weeks 12 through 18, Jake Browning was averaging 18.97 fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, was the number 4 overall quarterback in terms of fantasy points per game on average. So taking that onto consideration, the fact that Joe Burrow this offseason is healthy, is moving forward, has recovered from everything, and is going to finally have a good start to a season, because every season up until now has been a slow start for the Cincinnati Bengals because of these Joe Burrow injuries. And now that he's going in healthy, ready to go. On top of the fact that he's another year removed from that ACL injury, again, when you can go ahead and get rushing upside out of a guy like Joe Burrow, who last season, of course, was only averaging 0.9 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated, mainly because of that calf injury. You look back at 2022, of course, 3.17 fantasy points per game on average from rushing statistics. Again, nearly a touchdown extra per game in terms of fantasy points just off of his rushing ability average. You take into account the Bengals went ahead and they drafted an offensive lineman in the first round. They bring in guys like Mike Gesicki in order to at least have more depth at the tight end position. And quite frankly, this is the best tight end they have had on roster for years. I think this is all positive for Joe Burrow, as he is my number 5 going into 2024. To close out the A tier, let's talk about our number 6, Anthony Richardson, the second-year quarterback who, in my opinion, is going to take major steps forward. Now, last season, in the games in which he participated in, he showed us exactly what he is capable of. In the 2 full games he played in 2023, he scored a total of 50.52 fantasy points. That's an average of 25.26 fantasy points per game. Now, if in fact you go ahead and include the first quarter in which he played in week 2 prior to him getting injured and leaving that game, so basically playing 2.25 games last season, he scored 68.26 fantasy points throughout those. I mean, how many is that? That's 9 quarters of play. If you go ahead and take the per game averages for that, that's 30.34 fantasy points per game. Just putting it into perspective, in the games in which he played, he was averaging 10 rushing attempts, 48 rushing yards, and 1 rushing touchdown per game. That's 10.8 fantasy points per game just off of rushing statistics isolated. And of course, we know that this offense is going to continue to allow Anthony Richardson to run the ball. And that's exactly what Shane Steichen has said all offseason. We are going to allow Anthony Richardson to do what he does best, and that's running the ball. Shane Steichen, the former offensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles back in 2021 and 2022, helped Jalen Hurts accumulate 139 rushing attempts, 784 rushing yards, 10 rushing touchdowns in 2021. In 2022, 165 rushing attempts, 760 yards, and 13 rushing touchdowns. With all the offensive weapons that they're now adding to this team, you know, they go ahead and bring in Mitchell from the NFL draft. You get back a healthy Jonathan Taylor. You get back a healthy Jelani Woods. I really do believe that Anthony Richardson has all of the weapons at his disposal, has the best offensive coordinator possible for him to succeed. And as long as he can stay healthy, the running game difference that he is going to present for fantasy purposes, on top of his ability that he has already shown within the passing game, makes me think that he's very much so comparable to Cam Newton and or Josh Allen. So many of us should not be worried. And if in fact he ends up producing to the levels in which we anticipate, he could very easily surpass the number 6 overall standing going into 2024. Now, speaking of year 2 quarterbacks, let's move on to CJ Stroud to begin the B tier. And I honestly would not mind having him in the A tier. It's just a matter of, can he find himself an incredible volume of success? Because in order to keep pace with other guys like an Anthony Richardson, Lamar Jackson, who are going to be running the ball as much as they are, CJ Stroud is going to have to get into the conversation of 4,300 plus yards and 32, maybe 35 plus passing touchdowns, because his rushing ability is non-existent in comparison to these other quarterbacks. But nonetheless, what CJ Stroud was able to accomplish in his rookie season was remarkable. Even though he did have himself a stint in which he did get injured, he still was the number 9 overall quarterback by the end of the year, averaging 18.33 fantasy points per game in games in which, of course, he was healthy. Amongst all quarterbacks, he was number 3 in terms of total passing yards per game, 273.87. And the primary reason that was the case was because early on in the year, his offensive line was in shambles. 4 of the starting offensive linemen from weeks 1 through 4 were injured for this offense. They had to throw the ball for the entirety of games, primarily because the Houston Texans' offensive rushing attack was non-existent. So, of course, CJ Stroud took over. He developed very quickly and proved to everyone that if you put the ball in his hands, he is going to carry this team on his back. And that's exactly what he did as he led them to the NFL playoffs. Now, going into 2024, of course, he has a built rapport with guys like Nico Collins. And even though he wasn't able to build out that rapport with Tank Dell, because Tank Dell, of course, had a season-ending injury last year, they now bring in guys like Stephon Diggs, who over the course of the last 4 seasons with the Buffalo Bills has been an elite wide receiver in the National Football League and is going to continue that for the Houston Texans. And like I've mentioned in prior seasons, quarterbacks that go from year 1 to year 2 that have already found primary success in that year 1 often see themselves a lot more success in year 2. Specifically, if you look at quarterbacks from 2014 to 2023 who played 2 full seasons as a starter, their rookie year and their sophomore campaign, there were 28 quarterbacks they were able to accomplish that over the past decade. If you go ahead and take their year 1 to year 2 uptick in overall averages, we're talking about 10+% in terms of overall passing yards, 18+% in overall passing touchdowns, and 16.4+% in terms of overall fantasy points. CJ Stroud, in my opinion, should be able to take massive steps forward, not only because of the improvements around him within the receiving game, bringing also guys like Joe Mixon to establish a running game which will open up play action, but you're also getting a healthy offensive line, which quite frankly he did not have for majority of last season. I truly do believe that CJ Stroud has incredible upside, could very easily get himself into the top 5 conversation by the end of the 2024 season. Now moving on to our number 8 to stay within the B tier, let's also stay within the great state of Texas, going from Houston to Dallas, and let's talk about Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys. Of course, Dak Prescott, over the course of the last 4 seasons, has been incredible for fantasy purposes. I mean, you look at 2020, he was the number 1 overall quarterback in terms of fantasy points per game on average. 2021 was number 8. 2022 was number 11. And most recently in 2023 had himself an incredible year. He was the number 4 overall quarterback in terms of fantasy points per game on average. And in terms of his overall statistics and being able to carry the Dallas Cowboys as far as he was able to, it's quite impressive. Now, obviously, last season there was a bit of an offensive coordinator change in terms of the overall philosophy as to how, Mike McCarthy wanted to call games in comparison to how Kellen Moore had done in the past. And obviously, we saw an uptick of overall production from Dak Prescott. So hopefully going forward, Mike McCarthy's only going to get more comfortable with Dak Prescott and allow him to continue to dominate within the National Football League. Last season, amongst all teams, the Dallas Cowboys were number 11 in terms of passing attempts, number 5 in passing yards, and number 4 in passing touchdowns. And in many of those instances, throughout the season in which the Dallas Cowboys defense dominated and quite literally won games by themselves, you have to understand that there's going to be more opportunities for Dak Prescott to score this upcoming season. And even though the Dallas Cowboys defense, causing turnovers and getting the ball back for Dak Prescott is fantastic, there were games in which, of course, Dak Prescott was a non-factor because of the defense. Specifically, there was 2 instances. Last season against the New York Giants and the New England Patriots. The Dallas Cowboys won 40-0 against the Giants and 38-3 against the New England Patriots. In those 2 games, Dak Prescott scored 1 touchdown. The defense for the Dallas Cowboys scored a total of 4 touchdowns. So imagine if, in fact, this defense is more of a potential liability this year, and they're allowing other teams to score. And it's not really a, hey, we have to run the clock out in the second half. In fact, it's a, we need to continue to throw the ball and allow Dak Prescott to carry this team. I honestly think there's a potential opportunity in which Dak Prescott could be just as good as he was last year in 2024. And even though that this offense is losing 2 starting offensive linemen and they're replacing guys like Tony Pollard with Ezekiel Elliott, which in my opinion is a downgrade, and they lost Michael Gallup. Obviously, he went to the Raiders before retiring, but nonetheless, he retired, no longer on the team. They didn't bring in any other receiving help. Those are all negatives for this offense. But even with that all into account, I really do believe there's going to be more opportunities and game scripts that are going to be helpful for Dak Prescott's overall fantasy value, which in my opinion keeps him as the number 8. Moving on to our number 9, let's talk about Kyler Murray to begin the next tier. Kyler Murray last season obviously was fighting back and recovering from the ACL injury. But prior to the ACL injury, if we go back to 2022, from weeks 1 through 12, before the injury, he was averaging 19.99 fantasy points per game and was the number 7 overall quarterback in terms of fantasy point per game on average. Now we fast forward to 2023, post ACL injury and returning from weeks 10 through 18, was the number 10 quarterback in terms of fantasy points per game on average, averaging 18.3. Which again, fantastic numbers, especially considering he was returning from an ACL injury, which again, in many instances, quarterbacks have a little bit of a dip of overall production. And especially a quarterback of the caliber of Kyler Murray, who so much so relies upon his rushing upside to be a successful fantasy quarterback, he still was able to average last season 5.5 rushing attempts per game, 30.5 rushing yards, and 0.38 rushing touchdowns per game, which is 5.3 fantasy points per game on average within overall rushing statistics isolated. If you take his overall 2022 pace of play prior to the ACL, he was on pace for 112 rushing attempts, 706 rushing yards, 5 rushing touchdowns. He is a mobile quarterback who within this offense has already demonstrated he is very much so comfortable with the offensive coordinator, and now they're bringing in more weapons. You have guys like Marvin Harrison Jr. coming in, Zay Jones. You get another year of experience and now an offseason in which you can build a rapport with guys like Trey McBride, Michael Wilson Jr., and of course, Greg Dortch. I really do believe that Kyler Murray has a lot of potential for upside, and I understand that many of you may be afraid of his potential injury risk. All these quarterbacks within the top 12, all the quarterbacks in general will have injury risk. I mean, the last 2 seasons of the National Football League has literally consisted of the most unique quarterbacks started within single seasons ever. You go back to 2022, there were a total of, let me find this exact stat. Let me scroll over it. Let me find this thing. There was a total of quite literally 68 quarterbacks that started games in 2022. That's NFL record. Last season, the total was 66, which is the second most ever. So when you talk about healthy quarterbacks, honestly, there really isn't many that stay healthy for an entire year. So I'm not too worried about the potential of Kyler Murray. Again, outside of that huge ACL injury, there isn't anything that has really held him down throughout his entire career. And we know, going back to his 2020 stats, I mean, this is a guy that is capable of averaging 25 fantasy points per game because he has proven that in the past. All right, moving on to the next quarterback within this tier, we have Jordan Love, who is coming off of just 1 season out as a starter and now is the highest paid quarterback in NFL history. Pretty ridiculous, but nonetheless, I think he deserves it. I mean, the numbers that he was able to put up and accomplish within just his first season as a starter, and even though he may not have started hot for the first 8 weeks, yes, there were some highs, but there were definitely some lows throughout those instances. Late in the season, into the NFL playoffs, he easily went ahead and proved all the doubters wrong. Last season was the number 5 overall quarterback in fantasy football, averaging 18.77 fantasy points per game. He was able to score 2 or more touchdowns last season in 15 of the 19 games that he played. Of course, I'm including the NFL playoffs throughout that span of time. The Packers last season, of course, were able to score that many touchdowns, mainly because of their efficiency within the red zone. Amongst all teams in the National Football League, they had the second most attempts, the third most completions, fifth most passing yards, and the second most touchdowns within the red zone last season. In my opinion, the most successful team amongst all within that overall category. And hopefully going into this upcoming season, their youth building experience is only going to help. I mean, they have so much youth within this offense, and as they continue to build a rapport with one another, guys like, Jaden Reed, Wicks, Melton, Heath, Kraft, Musgrave, they were all rookies in 2023. Dobbs, Watson, Toure, they were all second-year players last season. This is really a young core. And yes, Josh Jacobs is going to be the veteran, and honestly, that is a great thing because he can absolutely be a leader for this offense. But considering all the youth that they have, all the rapport that they're going to continue to build, and the fact that this offense has the second easiest strength of schedule at the quarterback position, I really do believe that Jordan Love is in line for another great season. He's going to be given the opportunity to carry this team on his back, and he also has the ability to run the ball. In comparison to guys like CJ Stroud, he is a far more capable runner, but in comparison, like guys like, Lamar Jackson, of course, we're not in that range. But Jordan Love last season, 50 attempts for 247 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns. Those are fantastic numbers that are only going to continue to elevate his overall potential for play. Now let's move on to a quarterback that defeated Jordan Love last season in the playoffs. That's Brock Purdy, starting quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers, our number 11 for this year. Brock Purdy, amongst all quarterbacks last season, finished as the number 6 overall. In terms of fantasy points per game on average, 18.48. The prior season, with the 6 final games of the season, he was averaging 17.55 fantasy points per game. So increases overall fantasy point per game average by a whole point nearly, which of course is great because if he's going to continue to improve with more experience, he should continue to be a better quarterback. Now, I do have him as my number 11 because the lack of rushing potential and also, unfortunately, the lack of passing attempts within this offense. Amongst all teams in the National Football League, the 49ers were dead last in terms of total team passing attempts. You go back to the season prior, the San Francisco 49ers ranked 26th within this overall category. We know that Kyle Shanahan wants to run the ball, and we know that is going to potentially limit Brock Purdy's overall for upside in comparison to other teams who let their quarterbacks throw the ball, 600 plus times. But Brock Purdy, quite frankly, doesn't need all those attempts. Even with the lack of overall passing attempts, they were number 4 in overall passing yards last season and number 2 in terms of total passing touchdowns, primarily because of the yards after the catch ability of guys like Deebo Samuel, Christian McCaffrey, and George Kittle, who amongst all players all ranked within the top 17 within yards after the catch category. Not to mention you have guys like, Ricky Pearsall coming in a first-round pick. You still have Brandon Ayuk within this overall system. There is so much talent that surrounds Brock Purdy. He is in a perfect position to succeed. And, of course, Kyle Shanahan is going to continue to scheme up an offense that is going to allow him to be fantasy relevant. Now, let's move on to the next quarterback to close out our QB1 conversation. Just mentioning Brandon Ayuk moments ago, Brandon Ayuk this offseason wanted to go ahead and reunite with another quarterback, which could still happen if, in fact, he's traded. And that quarterback is Jayden Daniels. We heard a lot this offseason. Brandon Ayuk, if he is not to get a contract with the San Francisco 49ers, he would like to be traded to the Washington Commanders. Jayden Daniels, of course, a former Arizona State quarterback, played with Brandon Ayuk, but also most recently with LSU, was able to produce ridiculous numbers and, of course, capture a Heisman Trophy win in 2023. Now, when we go ahead and mention the idea of winning a Heisman Trophy, that does go a long way in terms of your potential for success in the National Football League, and I'll tell you why. When we look at the last 10 Heisman Trophy winning quarterbacks who have completed their rookie season, there have only been 2 of the 10 quarterbacks that averaged less than 17 fantasy points per game on average their rookie season. Those 2 quarterbacks being Bryce Young and Johnny Manziel. To clarify, Johnny Manziel only played 3 games his rookie season, so really he doesn't even count as an eligible prospect within this overall, calculation. So of the 9 eligible quarterbacks, only one of them has scored less than 17 fantasy points per game. The rest, of course, found themselves in abundance of success. And when you take into account what 17 fantasy points per game looks like over a 17-game season, that's 289 fantasy points, which would make Jayden Daniels in 2023, if he was to have held that, overall standing, the number 7 overall quarterback in fantasy football. So again, a lot of potential in line for Jayden Daniels and his upcoming rookie season. Now, let's talk about why I have so much confidence in Jayden Daniels. First and foremost, to win a Heisman, you have to be a talented player. But not only that, the fact that Jayden Daniels has been able to demonstrate that he can get it done on the ground and through the air is a huge bonus. His final year at LSU, 135 rushing attempts for 1,134 rushing yards and 10 rushing touchdowns. The season prior in 2022 with LSU, 186 rushing attempts, 885 rushing yards, 11 rushing touchdowns. He's a capable rushing quarterback. And this all reminds me of 2019 Arizona Cardinals, because very similar to what we see now with the Washington Commanders, we are getting a high overall draft pick in the form of Jayden Daniels with an offensive coordinator like Cliff Kingsbury. You go back to the 2019 Arizona Cardinals, they had the former number 1 overall selection Kyler Murray, who had won a Heisman and came out and had Cliff Kingsbury as his primary play caller and head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. And what Cliff Kingsbury was able to do was elevate Kyler Murray to a top 12 quarterback standing. Throughout that year, Kyler Murray, 3,700 passing yards, 544 rushing yards, 24 total touchdowns scored, averaging 18.17 fantasy points per game, was number 11 in terms of fantasy points per game on average, and number 12 overall amongst all quarterbacks. I truly do believe that Jayden Daniels is in line for a fantastic rookie season. The defense being a potential liability is great. That means more negative game scripts. That means more passing, more rushing late in games. I really do think that Jayden Daniels is capable of accomplishing this overall feat. Now, moving on to our number 13, we have Trevor Lawrence, which again is another one of these great quarterbacks, a former number 1 overall selection, who over the course of the last 2 seasons for fantasy purposes since Doug Peterson joined this team and took over the play calling of this offense, has elevated Trevor Lawrence to being a top 12 quarterback in both of those seasons. He's averaged 17.39 and 17.08 fantasy points in these 2 years. And even though Trevor Lawrence has demonstrated and shown us glimpses of greatness, it hasn't been sustained for a full season in either 2022 or 2023. Despite the fact that this team has been top 10 in passing attempts in both of those seasons, I still do believe that Trevor Lawrence is going to have to develop within the passing game in order to get himself to the next level for fantasy purposes. I mean, we have guys like Calvin Ridley and Jay Jones who are no longer within this offense. They're bringing in substitutes like Gabriel Davis and Brian Thomas Jr., and I'm sure that both of them are still going to make an immediate impact, but they're downgrades in comparison unless Brian Thomas Jr. immediately is going to be the successor of Calvin Ridley and get into that top 24 conversation at the position. But, we'll have to wait and see. Nonetheless, Trevor Lawrence barely holds on and retains this overall value of being my number 13 overall quarterback, primarily because of his rushing upside in comparison to the rest of the quarterbacks that we're going to mention going forward. When we look at Trevor Lawrence's overall statistics in terms of rushing, he's put up a base minimum of 325 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns in each of the last 2 seasons, which of course are great numbers for him overall, but they barely keep him afloat. The fact of the matter is, the thing that is quite appealing about Trevor Lawrence is the fact that he stays healthy. He has played 47 of the last 48 games that he's eligible to play, and of course will even play injured like he demonstrated late last season, which of course for fantasy purposes isn't great for his overall upside in those scenarios, in those games, in those contests, but nonetheless, I think going forward, he has value. He has the potential to, ascend within the overall rankings, but I believe that number 13 is a safe spot for him going into 2024. Moving on to the next tier, let's talk about another Heisman winning quarterback. It is Caleb Williams, who, like we just mentioned moments ago with Jayden Daniels, of the last 10 Heisman Trophy winning quarterbacks who have completed their rookie season, Okay, 9 of them were eligible in this circumstance that fully completed their season as a starter, because the one that didn't was Johnny Manziel. But of those 9 quarterbacks, only one of them averaged less than 17 fantasy points per game in their rookie season in the National Football League, that quarterback being Bryce Young. And as long as Caleb Williams isn't going to be thrusted into the Carolina Panthers offense of 2023, I think he'll be far better than what Bryce Young presented last season. Just putting into perspective what 17 fantasy points per game does on a 17-game pace, that's 289 fantasy points and the number 7 overall quarterback in 2023. Just putting it into perspective. Nonetheless, let's talk about why Caleb Williams is not joining an offense just as bad as the Carolina Panthers in 2023, because he's joining an offense that has just been overhauled. You bring in a new offensive coordinator in Shane Waldron, who has spent the last couple seasons resurrecting Geno Smith's career with the Seattle Seahawks. And throughout the 2022 season, when Geno Smith was healthy, he finishes a number 5 overall quarterback and number 11 overall in terms of fantasy points per game on average. Going into this year with the offense that surrounds Caleb Williams, I don't know if there's ever been a number 1 overall pick in the National Football League at the quarterback position to join a more talent-tacked roster than the Chicago Bears have in terms of offensive weapons. DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, Cole Kmet, Gerald Everett, DeAndre Swift, Roschon Johnson, so much talent across the board, running back, tight end, and wide receiver. And I understand this offensive line has had troubles in the past, but I do believe that Caleb Williams is a calculated and athletic enough quarterback to make plays out of the pocket and to be able to deliver, especially having a top 5 quarterback strength of schedule going into this upcoming season. He should be a great overall play as our number 14 going into 2024. All right, our number 15 to close out the E tier is Jared Goff. The reason why I have Jared Goff in this conversation is because he has shown sustained consistency and the ability to stay healthy and on the field. I mean, in the last 2 seasons, he has not missed a single game. So he has made every single start, and amongst all quarterbacks in the last 2 seasons, he has the 5th most total touchdowns scored, 61, and he has the 2nd most passing yards amongst all quarterbacks, 9,013. So now you bring back Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator, who's been the offensive coordinator for the last 2 seasons within this offense, who has helped them get to the 10th most passing attempts, 8th most passing completions, 10th most passing yards, 10th most touchdowns in 2023. And you progress with the idea of Jared Goff continuing to improve within this offense, going from a 16.66 fantasy point per game average in 2022, elevating that to 17.0 fantasy points per game in 2023. Maybe he takes another step forward in 2024. Again, when you're surrounded with an elite offensive line, an incredible run game, and of course, weapons of the caliber of Amon-Ra St. Brown, and of course, Sam Laporta, and all of the hype that we're hearing about Jameson Williams taking a step forward, we know that what he was capable of doing at Alabama in college. He hasn't been able to demonstrate that thus far throughout his NFL career, but has the ability to go ahead and grow as a player and improve. I mean, again, as a quarterback who has greatly benefited from the fact that other quarterbacks have gotten injured around him, again, averaging 16 to 17 fantasy points per game shouldn't make you a top 12 quarterback easily every single season, but that has been the case for Jared Goff, considering all the injuries that have taken place in the last 2 seasons to starting quarterbacks. The final thing I wanted to mention regarding Jared Goff was something that impressed me last season when I was digging through his overall stats. He had a career low 2.4% turnover-worthy play rate, which again, that means Jared Goff is improving. He's not turning over the ball, and he's giving himself and his team more opportunities to score every single time. All right, then let's go ahead and let's move on to another quarterback that we wanted to mention, beginning the F tier with Kirk Cousins. And even though Kirk Cousins on screen isn't wearing an Atlanta Falcons jersey, he will be joining the Atlanta Falcons post Achilles. Now, again, he tore his Achilles last season. And prior to that, I mean, he was dominating. From weeks 1 through 8 of last season was the number 6 overall quarterback, number 8 in terms of fantasy points per game on average. But over the course of the last couple seasons, he has been a top 12 quarterback on a consistent pace. And of course, with all of the talent that has surrounded him with the Minnesota Vikings, and of course, the offensive play calling of Kevin O'Connell, there may be a possibility in which joining the Atlanta Falcons could lead to a little bit of a downtick, on top of the fact that he is returning from the Achilles injury, which is why I have him at number 16. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what we're going to see out of Kirk Cousins, despite the fact that he is joining an offense that has Zach Robinson as the offensive coordinator, a former Rams coach between 2019 and 2023. Again, he was a quarterbacks coach. He was a passing game coordinator for that offense. Again, like I've mentioned over the course of the last 3 days, Kevin O'Connell, a former Rams coach himself. So there is a rapport already built there. So the offense that Zach Robinson is going to implement is something that Kirk Cousins is going to be very much so comfortable with and familiar with, whether that's via overall jargon or just concepts in general, or even identical plays. Nonetheless, going into this upcoming season, I do believe that there is a downtick of overall, talent around him, going from guys like Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, Jordan Addison, and inheriting London, Pitts, Mooney, Moore, and Bijan. Honestly, I think it's a little bit of a downtick in terms of the receivers, but outside of that, overall, pretty good overall kind of situation to land in for 2024. I think Kirk Cousins, with his elite offensive line and potential for play action, is going to be a solid quarterback. As to whether or not that Achilles injury is going to impact him, time will tell, but I think number 16 is safe as your potential quarterback too in 2024. Moving on to our number 17 to close out the F tier, Tua Tagovailoa. The thing about Tua Tagovailoa, and the thing that I mentioned in my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, is purely the concept of consistency at quarterback. We want consistent play. There's a reason why Jared Goff is ahead of Tua. Even though Tua has explosive games in which he can throw 4 passing touchdowns. Based on my consistency calculator, he ranked 20th amongst all quarterbacks last season in 2023, averaging only 15.9 fantasy points per game in comparison to 2022, which in the 10 healthy games he played was averaging 20.67 fantasy points per game. And hopefully he can get back to those overall numbers, maybe get back to scoring, 17, 18 fantasy points per game. That's the, fingers crossed, that's the hope. And with this offense that surrounds him, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, bringing in guys like Odell Beckham, Jonnu Smith, you have Achane, and of course Mostert. With all the talent that surrounds him, he's certainly capable of elevating to that level. But the biggest reason he wasn't able to accomplish it was primarily because of the fact that this offense, they were tied amongst all teams with the Detroit Lions and the San Francisco 49ers for most rushing touchdowns by a team, 27. And none of which went in the direction of Tua Tagovailoa. When you have guys like Raheem Mostert and, of course, Devon Achane scoring all the rushing touchdowns, and it's not giving Tua Tagovailoa the opportunity to score even more touchdowns within the red zone, of course, it limits its overall potential for success. But again, consistency has been an issue with him, and I'm going to continue to have him at number 17 because I don't believe, unless he's in a fantastic matchup, he'll be able to deliver on a consistent basis, especially considering in the last 2 seasons against the AFC East, which again, he plays 6 times a year. In the last 8 games he has played against them in the last 2 years, he's averaging only 13.66 fantasy points per game. Now, speaking of the AFC East, staying on topic, let's go ahead and let's talk about Aaron Rodgers and him returning from his post-Achilles injury. Of course, this could be considered the greatest and fastest recovery of an Achilles injury of all time. He almost played last season if it wasn't for the fact that Zach Wilson just couldn't throw the ball. But again, we know that this is the oldest quarterback in the National Football League. He's coming off a season-ending injury, and the question is he mobile enough? Is he healthy enough to protect himself? This offense revamped their offensive line, bringing in 3 new starters, and additionally using a first-round pick and draft capital, 11th overall, to draft an offensive tackle, which obviously is great. They're bringing in weapons like Mike Williams, who he himself is coming off an ACL injury, but with all of the weapons that already surround him within this offense, the familiarity he has with the offensive coordinator, the elite defense, it should lead to Aaron Rodgers having great performances here and there throughout the year. Do I believe that he is going to be the Aaron Rodgers of old? Is he going to be MVP Aaron Rodgers? I don't believe that to be the case. But hey, it's not out of the realm of possibility that he's able to have himself a year in which he could potentially be a low-end QB1. It's just a matter of how successful this Jets offense is going to be and how often is Breece Hall going to be scoring rushing touchdowns rather than Aaron Rodgers dumping it off to all of the receivers that he has within this offense. Moving on to our number 19, another one of these veteran quarterbacks who, of course, have had their fair share of injuries over the course of their career is Matthew Stafford. If you go back to 2021, those were career high numbers. 41 passing touchdowns throughout the regular season for Matthew Stafford as a member of the Rams. And obviously after that, we didn't see a healthy Matthew Stafford in 2022. And for the first half of 2023, we didn't even see a healthy Matthew Stafford. Throughout that span of time, from weeks 1 through 7, a 59% passing completion percentage, was averaging only 14.3 fantasy points per game, which was 18th amongst all quarterbacks. Then you go to weeks 12 through 17. After he returned from his injury, the thumb injury that, of course, he sustained, he missed some time with, 68% passing completion percentage, averaging 284 passing yards per game, 2.5 passing touchdowns per game, and 20.3 fantasy points per game, was the number 7 overall fantasy quarterback throughout that span of time, weeks 12 through 17 of the 2023 season. We haven't seen a healthy Kupp-Stafford combination since 2021, and I think we're going to get it this season. And if in fact it comes to fruition and both of them can stay healthy, Matthew Stafford should very easily be able to surpass his number 19 overall rank. The issue that we have is that in comparison to a lot of these other quarterbacks, again, up there in age, and of course the potential of him sustaining an injury is definitely on the table. Even last season in that playoff game against the Detroit Lions, he got hit so hard that I'm pretty sure he got a concussion within that game. He's tough enough to play through injuries, but it certainly does diminish the overall, product that he has for our fantasy teams. Nonetheless, someone that is of value and my number 19. The final quarterback I wanted to mention is Justin Herbert. Prior to this video, I had him ranked way higher, but as I was doing my research and of course developing all of the statistics and of course all the things that I wanted to mention to you guys over the course of today's video, we discovered that a couple days ago, of course, he left practice with a plantar fasciitis injury. Everything that I know about that injury is that it does not heal after 2 weeks. And they're saying that they're going to put him in a boot and have him, rest for 2 weeks and then progressively kind of get him back into the mix. I think this is going to be an injury that potentially plagues him for the entirety of the season. It is going to be one that is going to be very much so painful. And it's just going to be a question of how much pain, tolerance does he have? And additionally, is it worth the Los Angeles Chargers to keep him out there if in fact he's injured, playing injured, and of course not keeping himself protected because of a lack of mobility? That is the risk. Of course, that all taken into account, we'll have to keep it monitored over the course of the season. If in fact he was fully healthy and I knew that it was, without a doubt, not going to affect him, he would be far higher ranked. In fact, I'd probably have him ahead of Kirk Cousins going into the season. We know that this guy's been a top 12 quarterback in each of the last 3 seasons. I understand that most recently, prior to the injury, he was the number 6 overall quarterback in fantasy football, but losing guys like Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, etc., that is a big deal. But nonetheless, my number 20, primarily because I needed to mention him. Otherwise, I didn't want it to be top 19. I wanted it to be top 18, but I wanted to go ahead and just give you guys a little bit of an understanding as to how I'm approaching the Justin Herbert situation as it currently stands. All right, that's going to cover it for my top 20 fantasy quarterbacks for the 2024 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. Again, if you're trying to get your handings on my full expansive rankings, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, flex, half PPR, full PPR, by position, by tier, check out the Patreon. You can either subscribe there or potentially check out Underdog Fantasy using code Andrew and making a first-time deposit minimum of $10 immediately gets you my rankings, whether it is this offseason, the draft guide, or for the remainder of the season, spanning from weeks 1 through 18. Thank you everybody for watching, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.